I do find it weird that the shadows start moving openly in this episode. There's a question I want to ask, but none of my viewers can answer it without getting into spoilery stuff. So all I'm going to say is, even to this day, having rewatched this series several times, I've never quite understood why the shadows move openly, given what we learn about them and their mentality later. But even up to this point in time, they've been all about proxies. We've suspected for some time that they're behind quite a few events in the makings of this setting, not the least of which being the most obvious, the Clark administration, which we have 100% confirmation of what we've always suspected in this episode. The fact that the Clark administration is actually the Shadow administration. I've talked before about my theory that Clark himself is such a pathetic and generally useless kind of individual that he could never actually pull off that kind of a thing by himself. It would require some kind of backing, which could have happened from normal people, but didn't. Speaking of which, I love Dr. Franklin's line right at the beginning. Why else would they let ISN back on the line? Maybe I'm an incredible cynic or something, but my very first thought was, oh god, they're starting to propagandize the ISN. In fact, if I'm being blunt, I am amazed they haven't done so before now. It took them that long to get ISN all set up and like, okay, we've got our lies straight, we know what we're doing. Let's talk about how amazing the Clark administration is. Let's talk about how rogue elements and blah, blah, blah. The only thing I would criticize about it is the woman they got to portray that. I don't know if this is on the actress or the director, but someone told that woman to smile 100% of the time, and then to smile in her tone as well. It comes across as kind of sickening, actually. And, well, like a lie. It sounds like a lie, in addition to the fact that it is a lie. I find myself wondering, though, hear me out, that could be a deliberate writing choice. Because, at that point, the lie itself is not relevant. What is relevant is the information being conveyed, which is, we know we're lying, you know we're lying, but if you try to do anything against us, I'm afraid you're going to have the same fate happen to you that happened to the former ISN people, of which I am not one of them. In other words, that by being so blatant about their lies, they are effectively conveying different information, which is entirely feasible. So we see the new Star Furies. Woo! Star Furies Mark II. They're awesome ships, really. They're not my favorite fighters of all time, but they're very nice fighters. I do like the fact that this is not the first time that Babylon 5 has more or less incidentally gotten armament upgrade, and it has been relevant, and will be relevant in the future. It's nice, especially since B5 needs all the help it can get even now, despite the fact that we have had a genuine, real victory, finally. We're still in a situation where at any moment things could get very bad very quickly. Which is funny, given what happens in this episode. I mean, I already talked about it. The shadows start moving openly. So we finally managed to make a bit of a stand against the Clark administration, which has been effectively the big bad. Not really, but it's been the main focus of this series for quite some time. And then we find out, by the way, that enemy we just barely survived, yeah, they're actually just a puppet of the guys who we've known about for even longer. And those guys are now actually moving. Isn't that great? Oh, God, we're screwed. Oh, God. Oh. I love how hesitant they are around Bester. A few people actually point flat out, you know, why is he even a threat at this point? I mean, yeah, he could do some damage, but it's really unlikely they're going to send a high-profile, high-value individual like Bester out here in order to do basically a suicide mission. You know, a quick kill the command staff and then die, because that's what would happen. No. And there's not really a lot of information to be gained by scanning them, because, again, they've already openly rebelled against the Clark administration. Now, he could have been playing a longer game, but I think logically at this point, Bester would have only been there if it served his interests. and possibly the cores. Which brings me to the wonderful scene between Bester and Ivanova. Let me just take an aside and say that there's a reason I usually think of Walter Koenig as Bester rather than Chekhov. He nails the role. He does all three facets of the role pretty much perfectly. He does the human. We actually see the first of that in this episode. He does the smug snake, which he does very well. And he does the deadly serious, which in my opinion is the closest thing to the real Bester. He puts on this facade of, you know, but based on a lot of scenes, including the ones in the episodes leading up to this one, and future ones, I think that smug snake is just another aspect of his presentation, I think is the word I want to use. In character, I mean. I don't mean Walter Koenig's presentation. I mean Bester's presentation. I think it's another tool in his arsenal to convince people or talk to people. In fact, you remember how I mentioned earlier the possibility that the ISN lady was deliberately lying overtly so that people would get it? The threat of a lie, basically? I think, well, I know Bester does that several times in this episode. And I think that that's kind of a deliberate tie-in between the two. Because Lord knows that JMS and the writers of Babylon 5 in general like to do those kind of thematic tie-ins between the so-called A-plot and B-plot, even though the ISN thing isn't actually an A-plot, or B-plot, or D-plot. But I love the scenes with Bester. He is smarmy and pretty crude, and he pretty much pushes Ivanova right up until the point at which she slaps him. That's the moment Bester realizes he can't push her anymore. He has to back off. He has had his fun, and he has presented to her exactly what she expects to see: a smug, slimy snake. He then drops that facade like that and starts hitting her with blunt truth. Here's an unfortunate fact. One of the easiest ways to deceive people is with the truth. I don't mean misinterpreting the truth. That's another thing. I mean, if you tell someone blunt, honest truth, it has a bit of a raw shock value, especially if they don't expect you to tell the truth. And in so doing, they don't really learn whatever you're really thinking. You have the availability to keep things to yourself that way. And that is exactly what Bester does. He nails her with truth. And I don't just mean about the mission. He flat out says, yes, I am superior to you because I am a telepath. Telepaths are the way of the future. Mundanes are worthless, blah, blah, blah. He hits her with all of that. And in so being so bluntly truthful, so bluntly honest, at no point does it occur to her, in the immediate thereafter, to take it to presume that he is lying. Even though he does then lie afterwards. What's being carried by them? Weapons cargo, or weapons supplies, or whatever it is. Even though he knows at that point that they are telepaths. Although it's worth noting he didn't know she was in there. I also, I like his supply and demand line. It's very Bester. I don't know how better to say that. It takes generations to breed a telepath. Keep in mind they do have a eugenics program going. He himself mentions this, a wife and child. And yet, you mundanes breed like rabbits. And if you remove anything like thought or emotion or morality or anything else like that from the equation, from a basic mathematical perspective, he's absolutely right. From a supply and demand perspective, a telepath is worth way more normal humans. Mundanes. I find it very amusing, then, that he is, so honest about that blatant bias, specifically to help ensure that they think that he's telling the truth in all matters rather than just in some. Also, I think it's funny that in this episode, Walter Koenig finally got to take the chair, yeah! He never got to command the Enterprise, but now he's commanded the White Star for like 3 seconds. He gets all comfortable on it, dude. You can almost tell that was added in just for Koenig. Excuse me, I have trouble pronouncing his name. I've heard he himself say it several different ways, so I'm always trying to say it properly. So we have the double reveal on the telepaths. First of all, that they're the telepaths. That's not really the reveal, though. The real reveal is what they're being used for. Now, this isn't quite new information. Anybody who's been paying up attention up to this point could tell you that the Shadows are using people from Earth as CPU cores, and since the Shadows have an invested interest in Psy-Core, they're probably using telepaths as cores. However, the reveal, the second reveal, or actually technically the third reveal, comes from the fact that we realize they're doing that for a very specific and intentional reason. That they are using this as part of their, shall we say, defense against telepathic interruption in the structure of their ships. And the fact that and the episode does a great job of leaving all the pieces there for you to pick up, if you happen to be paying that kind of attention. There's a lot of little bits of information throughout the episode. And I love that it's Garibaldi who actually puts it all together. Because of course he does. He's frickin' Garibaldi. He's the detective. And he looks for complex answers, complex solutions. So he puts all these little pieces together and he says, guys, we finally have a way to defeat the Shadows. And I like that. Because it's not only necessary, but it's well played. I've spoken against the idea of the Deus Ex Machina many, many times in fiction. Probably the most egregious example that most of my viewers are aware of is the frickin' catalyst over in Mass Effect 3. You know, we gotta build the Crucible, we've gotta do this. If we don't, we won't be able to win. We can't defeat them conventionally! It's a problem a lot of writers struggle with, including me, actually. You have to make your opponent stronger than you, so that well, you don't have to, but you generally want to make your antagonist stronger than the protagonist, so the protagonist has to be clever or smart or courageous or outthink or outmaneuver, and thus prove themselves better than the antagonist in action, not just in morality or whatnot, right? It's a very common thing. I would say one of the most common literary tropes that exists, the superior antagonist being defeated by the inferior protagonist. Thing is, it's actually harder than you'd think to strike that balance without it being ridiculous. In some cases, they try to make it so the antagonist is basically not actually stronger. In fact, they're basically the inferior one, and it comes across exactly how it looks. Or in some cases, they have it where the antagonist is so overwhelmingly powerful that the only way to defeat them is a Deus Ex Machina, a Hail Mary, basically. And that's very, very, very common in fiction, to the point that I am absolutely sick of it at this point. Not just because it's kind of not great writing, I hesitate to call it bad writing, but it's definitely not good writing, but also because of its massive oversaturation. So the Shadows are pretty clearly superior to the unified force against them. But that's mostly a matter of military superiority as well as superiority of technology. We have seen that through careful, very precise effort, the Army of Light can actually oppose the Shadows, as long as the Army of Light is dictating the circumstances of the encounter. Now we have the ability to have an additional weapon to give us just a leg up. One leg up. They still outnumber us. They still have superior tech. They still have superior weapons. But we now have one leg up on them, which will enable us to actually hurt them and fight against them. And this is really important, the Shadows have already, for some time at this point, been moving to correct that particular weakness. So it's not really a Deus Ex Machina, it's more like an advantage, which is nice, and exactly the way it should be, and I like that. Excuse me. I have a note here. There's actually several other scenes where Bester deceives by telling the truth. I'm not going to go over the specifics. I like the scene with his lover, with his love, if you will, where the scream shifts into the sound of the klaxons. That's not only great directing, but it's also a nice little touch given that she was literally trying to merge with the station. I also like how they never say it outright. I love how Babylon 5 treats you like you have a frickin' brain. But Franklin hits her with something, and she immediately calms down. But it wasn't a sedative. She hit her. He injected her with the anti-telepath stuff that they have on hand, that they've already demonstrated the usage of on Bester, and they even mentioned in this episode, just to make sure you're aware of it, just in case. I also like the irony of Bester's alliance, because Bester was willing to work with them basically for his own ambitions, and nothing more. These people are in charge of Earth right now. and I want to be in charge of Earth. So let's take them down. It's kind of like if Arcturus Mensk walked up to Raynor and said, I want to be Emperor of the Dominion. Come help me. Take down the Confederacy. You know? And that's kind of what Bester does. I say it's ironic, though. That's actually an inaccurate term. Because I know everyone gets all specific about the usage of irony. But I do find it amusing how Bester's alliance becomes a clear dedication to the cause, and Bester becomes someone who will actually put real effort, rather than surface effort, into the Army of Light, because of the fact that now he has a personal interest. And ironically, the reason we can count on Bester is because he's a horrible person. What I mean by that... Well, I'm not one to speak against, caring more about someone you love or as your family or your friend more than other people, because that's a fairly common human condition. You probably like, your friend or your mother or your lover more than you do some random stranger you've never met, right? Fairly normal. But what I mean by that is usually when that's presented, it's presented as something that, a captain must overcome to be able to send a loved one to death, kind of a thing. Voyager covered that semi-recently. TNG covered that a few times as well. But here we see that Bester, who is a very selfish individual, who really only cares about himself and probably her and their child. So those are the only people that matter. Everyone else can go burn, as far as he's concerned. So because he is such a selfish, neutral, evil character, they can rely on him, because they are helping the one he cares about. I love it. That's why I originally wrote that down as ironic, because it is his evil nature that allows him to work for the forces of good. Of course, we see the revelation of how the shadow ships work. I already mentioned that. I really like Jacquard's scenes. It's funny because they never say it outright, again, but the implication is there that the reason they didn't want to allow Jacquard into the Army of Light, into the Council, is because of the fact that is brought up in this episode, that both Sheridan and Delenn felt so guilty about not moving to openly help him. While they did help a great number of Narn during the war against the Centauri, if you'll remember, even then, that aid had to be unofficial. Here they reveal that they might have been able to do something to save those Narn, and they deliberately chose not to, ensuring the destruction of those Narn. Now that's kind of the difference. The scenes are powerful, very powerful, mostly because Andreas Katsoulas is freaking amazing. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, because I'm terrible. But you can see through the way he acts that logically he understands that it wasn't a choice between saving the Narn or sacrificing the Narn. It was a choice between sacrificing the Narn in the hopes of saving them, or I'm saying this wrong, of trying to save the Narn and almost guaranteed failing, or allowing their destruction in the hopes of saving them later. Basically, the variance in perspective here being now or then, and neither one was guaranteed. And he shows his understanding of that. But what I find so interesting is he doesn't forgive Delenn for that. He understands, he comprehends it, and he says flat out how horrible this is. His line about, who knew a single sentence could be the greatest burden I've ever known. I think the thing, though, personally, that really gets to him is the thing she does that is very Narn. Narn are really big on actions. Results. Do. Verb, right? She comes to his place, or actually he comes to hers, but alone. No guards, no defenses, and she lays it out, most of it, and says, here, this is what happened, this is what we did, this is why we did it. Note she doesn't try to apologize until the end of the meeting. She owns up to what she does, in other words. Remember, if you say you're sorry, you're not saying you're sorry to make it better. You're saying you're sorry because you're sorry, and you do so with the understanding that you might not be forgiven. She goes there, and he flat out says, if you had told me this, when the Centauri were bombing my world, I would have killed you on the spot. And her response, with tears in her eyes, is, yes, I understand that. The unspoken thing in the room is that if he decided that she arranged this meeting and laid out the truth for him, knowing that he could still very well have that response. In fact, it was probably what she was expecting, and she was willingly offering up her life in repentance, in offering, in a way to try and balance the scales for what she did, to try and atone for what she did. And I think it is that action that really got his attention and brought him into the reality of the situation, that pulled him out of the emotion of despair and rage and allowed him to focus on why she did it. And as he himself says, she was right. I mean, I hate to say that, but she was right. If they had tried to overtly warn the Narn, it would not have changed a damn thing for the better. And it very likely would have made things much worse. So, yeah. We, of course, then get the first shot of the war room, which is awesome. And G'Kar joins them. I am honored to be here with you. About frickin' time, by the way. I'm sorry. I know. G'Kar is such an awesome character, and I'm super biased because I love him as a character, but it's about time that he gets to formally join the Army of Light. I mean, he's practically been a member of the Army of Light for quite some time now. At the very least, since he attacked Londo. At the very latest, I'd say. Or, more accurately, since that episode. Right after he attacked Londo. And then the shadows start moving openly. Why do they do things themselves? I have some thoughts on that, but I'm going to save those for later. For now, I'm going to go ahead and cut this off and start working on the next episode. See you next time, guys.